Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for another very special edition of Wowza Live with Ned Dennison and myself.
Hello, everyone. I've been unsuccessful in getting Mr. Munatonis to do an interview about himself, but I have been successful about getting him to talk about other incredible events that he's witnessed. Steve as an elite swimmer. He was a professional swimmer at one point, won one of the majors in our sports, and then he was the USA national coach for 9 years. He's also been involved in FINA, so he's seen the sport from a number of different angles. So good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
We're going to be talking about the 25-kilometer World Championship in Lake Saint Jean. Before we get into that actual race, tell us about your history at Lake Saint Jean, particularly in the water and also not the water, and why that was a special course over time, and what was different about this World Championship.
So, Lake Saint John is the famous race in Quebec. It's historic. Everybody great has competed there. You swim across the lake. It's almost a perfectly circular lake. Nowadays, swimmers swim in packs, draft off one another, and you just basically, it's a very tactical race for much of the swim. Some years it can be cold. Some years it could be warmer. Some years it could be very flat. Some years there could be an oncoming wind. The particular year that I did it, it was a little bit foggy, as I recall. Personally, I had psyched myself out. Everybody told me it was incredibly cold. It was cold, but I got through it. I just remember my particular boat was heading for something. Because there's fog, I couldn't really see much in the morning, and when we got closer to the end of the lake, I just remember being way off and not swimming to the finish point. I remember looking at the finish point, and it was way down there. So it was great. I think I finished under 9 hours or thereabouts. I had a great time before, and I had a great time afterwards. It was I was much more into the experience of being in this very famous place where I knew many famous swimmers had gone before me. I enjoyed the pre-race dinners, the speeches, the concerts, the fireworks shows. It was a real experience, and that was in 1984.
You had your name on the side of the car in the parade?
Yes, that was unbelievable.
First time ever?
It was actually my second time, because in that particular year, that particular basically a 6-week period, I did 5 swims. I did Lake Saint John, I did Memphremagog, I did Lake Saint John, Cabo San Lucas, and Manhattan Island. Each of those times I was with, some of the greatest in the sport, Paul Asmuth, Claudio Plitt, Shelley Taylor-Smith, James Kegley, and Philip Rush. So this is when I first met these individuals. Everybody was very helpful. I learned something on every single race. Atlantic City was very cold, and very few people finished that year. And then we swam in, and then 5 weeks later, we were in Cabo San Lucas. So water temperature ranged from 12 degrees Celsius in Atlantic City to, probably somewhere around 30 to 32 degrees in Cabo San Lucas. The ability, and this is 1 week after another. athletes in those years, and probably in contemporary times too. We basically bummed rides off of each other. I had a rental car, and I was with my father, who was the coach, my coach. And so I forgot exactly who was in our car, but between each of these stops along the way, from Atlantic City to Lake Memphremagog to Lake St. John, and then back to JFK at the time, there was always 2 or 3 swimmers in the car with us. And we would talk, we would eat, and we would drive from race to race. So it was a really special time to know Philip Rush. At the time, he was talking about, his plans for the English Channel. Paul Asmuth was preparing for his English Channel swim. Shelley was very new to the sport at the time, so she was in the very beginning of her career. Claudio was, at that time, I don't know how many swims he had under his belt. So listening to these people was a real honor for me. Eating with them. I remember Claudio would finish off the evening with either donuts or ice cream. And I said, Claudio, that you're putting in a lot of calories there. And he sort of pat his stomach. He says, don't worry. This is, I'm going to put this to good use. Because he always got out of the water, just not cold. Philip Rush was just this immovable object. He would finish. I'd come out of the water, let's say at Lake St. John or Atlantic City. I'd come out shivering from a pre-race swim, and Philip would, grab something cold water or grab a beer and just drink it because he was overheating. It was really a great time. And this is in the 1980s. Then I had the fortune to be selected as one of the USA national team coaches. And in 2001, that began at a world championship in Japan, where from 2001 to 2009, I was every year I'd be on the circuit or at a world championship or at some international competition like the Pan-Pacific Swimming Championships, the European equivalent of, the America's European equivalent of the European Championships. And again, I would meet my contemporaries, Paul Asmuth, Philip Rush, Claudio, and others from Italy and Spain, et cetera. So it was very nice to see that competitors eventually transitioned themselves to either coaches or administrators or FINA officials. So dialing forward to 2010, I was on the US team as a coach, and I go to Lake St. John, which I had not been. So from 1984 to 2010, I had not been up to Quebec, and I was able to go back to the Quebec. But the situation between the traditional traversée, the cross lake swim, and the World Championships was actually very remarkably different. So the traversée, you get bused to the other side of the lake and you swim across. This time, the organizers had organized the entire races. So all the races, the 5K, the 10K, and the 25K races, all in the finish area within the breakwater. And what that meant was the real tough conditions of wind and cross currents, et cetera, the athletes did not face. They were within the breakwater, and it was a 2.5K loop. So for the 5K race, typical, 2 loops. It's basically a sprint race amongst professional marathon swimmers. So, that went on well. There was the 10-kilometer race. Again, this is in 2010. So the the 10K race had just begun to gain much more importance than the other races, because in 2008, it was the first time a 10K race, any race, was elevated to Olympic status. So the 10K race is very, very important for the swimmers and the teams. And then you had the 25K race in a 2.5K loop. So they were swimming 10 times around the course. And that presented all kinds of interesting stories that we'll get into.
So before the 25K swim, let's talk about what happened before that, because there was some drama and controversy in some of the shorter races, and that probably played into some of the tactics and strategies. Tell us about that, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. The first race that I recall was the women's 10K race. It was won by Martina Grimaldi, an international marathon swimming Hall of Famer and Olympic medalist. You also had Angela Meyer. She eventually placed fifth. Again, another honoree. You had at that time a very young Anna Marcela Cunha, another eventual multiple world champion, and another honoree. Carrie Ann Payne finished eighth, another silver medalist, a power in her own right, multiple world champion. And then you had actually it was interesting. In 2010, there was a young lady, Eva Fabian, originally from the Northeast. She was trained by her father, and 2010 was literally, I believe, her peak. She won the 5K race later in the competition. But on the 10K race, which was the opening race for this 2010 FINA World Open Water Swimming Championships, she was dominant, absolutely dominant. She actually was leading the 10K race by a fairly comfortable margin. Again, if you imagine, Carrie Ann Payne was a silver medalist from 2008. You had Martina Grimaldi, always a force. She would eventually win a medal in 2012. And you had Anna Marcela, who got fifth, as I think she was a 17-year-old at the 2008 Olympics. So you had some real top of the line or top echelon swimmers who were really at their peak, and this small woman, young lady, Eva Fabian, just took it to them. In the last loop of this 4-loop race, Eva was ahead of everybody. She was followed by Poliana Okimoto of Brazil, another honoree and eventual Olympic medalist. And Eva was really on her way to win a gold medal. But on the last leg, what at that time we called the intermediate buoy. So it wasn't a turn buoy, it was this intermediate buoy. She went on the left side of the buoy instead of the right side of the buoy. And I could be wrong on which side she went, but it was clear that Miss Fabian was going to win this race, and Pollyanna was I would say a body or maybe a body behind her, and then Arielle Muller of France and Marina Lemperta of Greece. Again, two other Olympians in the 10K. They were following behind. Everybody followed Eva because she was leading. And it was the time when the referee judged that he had said before the race that you have to go on this side of the the intermediate buoy, not that side of the intermediate buoy, on the last leg. That rule has since been overturned right now in contemporary times. If you have an intermediate buoy, the athletes can choose whether they can go on the left or the right. But at that time, in the heat of the battle, at the last part of the race, Eva just went on literally the wrong side of the intermediate buoy. So she wasn't cutting off anything. It was just a straightaway. And she went this way instead of that way. And so the top 4 swimmers at that time were disqualified. They were red carded. They were disqualified after they finished the race. So everybody's cheering. They finish, and the top 4 people are disqualified. Then there was a mix-up with Melissa Gorman. She was also red carded. Eventually, Swimming Australia protested her disqualification. It was literally overturned 3 days later. It might have been 2 days later, but it wasn't an immediate overturn. There was discussions and everything. And eventually, Melissa Gorman, another 2-time Olympian, she was reinstated, and she got 3rd. So you had this drama in the very first part of the race. I mean, the very first part of this week-long competition. And therefore, the atmosphere was on edge. The Americans, the Greeks, the Brazilians, the French, they were upset because their athletes had been disqualified. You had the Australians who were upset. Now they finally were vindicated with their athlete getting a bronze medal. But then you had the Chinese athlete who had finished ahead, or had a medal. She went to the award ceremony, got her bronze medal. 2 days later, she has to return it back and give it to someone else. So you had all kinds of people. You had the Australians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Greeks, the French, the Brazilians, all upset after the first race. And that was sort of the atmosphere of Lake St. John. Now, remember, Lake St. John, it's a celebration. You finish the race. It doesn't matter if you're the first swimmer in the traversée or the last swimmer. When you cross that line, the crowds are just cheering for you. It's very supportive. As I was telling you, I'm here competing against Claudio and Philip Rush and Paul Asmuth and all these greats. But really, it's a very communal, very supportive community. We have lots of camaraderie. We laugh. We eat. Breakfast, lunches, and dinners with one another. We warm up together. We train together. Now, once a race starts, it's a race. And so you had Lake St. John with its very nice historical ambiance, and the French being wonderful hosts. Then the very first race of the World Championships, you have all kinds of controversy. You have upset people. You have protests. You have everything. So that set the stage for the rest of the competition.
Let's make sure you don't get butchered. The people in Quebec are great hosts. Many of them are French Canadian. You said the French. You got to be careful.
Sorry.
Be careful.
Yes, my apologies for everybody in the entire Eastern.
So you and I played water polo for a long time, and one thing we know for sure is that when there was a referee who had done something strong or dramatic, and you had the next game coming, you certainly knew that, and it changed a little bit the way you approached the game, and you may have kept your mouth shut more than you would have otherwise. So how well did you know Alex Meyer before this 25K race?
Pretty well. Again, I had been the coach since 2001, and that includes going to all the national team training camps. I would be out on a kayak or a boat training Alex in everywhere from Lake Placid to Long Beach, California. We had traveled together. Alex, I forgot the first year that he was, it might have been 2006 or so. Alex was a graduate of the same university I was, so we swam at the same pool at Harvard. I knew his coach, his college coach. So I knew him fairly well, and the team that was there, it included Fran Crippen, who had later passed away in a FINA competition. It included Eva, who had just, been disqualified. I had, sat with her and her father countless hours, explaining the tactics at a international competition, which were dramatically different than a U.S. domestic competition. So the U.S. would always choose its athletes at its national championships, and I always laughed and joked, but it was actually quite serious. The U.S. domestic competition was very meek and mild. They all swam like gentlemen and ladies. There was very little physicality. Again, we're talking, early part of this century. Then you go to the international competition, and you had chipped teeth, broken ribs, black eyes, fat lips, things that you expect when the New York Athletic Club plays the Olympic Club in water polo. And it was happening around the buoys, around the turn feeding stations. So that was an atmosphere that, as a coach of the U.S. team, we had to prepare our athletes who were not at those years. They weren't traveling a lot to the European competitions, and the knowledge about drafting and positioning, even feeding, was fairly. The Americans were less experienced, certainly, than the Europeans. And again, here comes this young lady, Eva Fabian, on the very first race, and she wins. So Alex had been watching this at the time. There was the 10K race, the 5K race, which Eva eventually won. Alex watched Thomas Lures, who won the men's 10K race, beat his close friend and buddy, Fran Crippen, in a very tactical, very fast race. I'm sorry, that was the 5K. You had Spiridon from Greece, eventual silver medalist. You had Chad Ho. You had Valerio Cleri. You had all these great swimmers that Alex had watched, both on the male and female side, in the 5 and 10K. And Alex, being a really studious observer of the swims, he was taking this all in. And Alex only had one race, the 25K, and that was the very last race of the week-long competition. So I knew him fairly well.
So tell us about the first five laps of this 25K race, the first half of the race.
Yeah, it was interesting because when you have the 5K or the 10K races, the men and women swim on different days. So you have the women's 10K race, the men's 10K race, the 5K, the 10K. It's all separated by day. And that's why the World Championships is generally a week-long competition. But the 25K race, because obviously the length of the race, and it's the end of the competition, they put the men and women in together. So, they're both in competing together. In this particular race in Lake St. John, the men began, I believe, 15 minutes ahead of the women. So, and in a 2.5K loop, that meant that the men had 15 minutes ahead of the women as they're going around the loop at a 2.5K. That's roughly, it's taking them an hour to go around, give or take whatever time I'm sorry, a half an hour, not
Half
an
an
hour.
hour, yeah.
Less than a half an hour to go around. So the men are already halfway around the loop and the women start. This meant that the men eventually would catch the women, and then you would have men and women mixed up together. Now, this is a very, very important part of the race, because in the previous year, in 2009, at the World Championships in Rome, Alex was in this exact same position. And Alex, in the last part of the race, went around the buoy and swam over or somehow clipped the arms of a female swimmer and was red carded. So Alex was disqualified in a men's world championship race because he had interfered with a female swimmer. And I had never thought that could happen, but it did. And so Alex was very, very conscious about when the men were coming around to swim with the women. He was very conscious of that because he did not want a replay of what happened the year before at the World Championships, where he would have won. Either he would have won the race or he would have certainly medaled. And so in that scenario, the men actually took off fairly slowly because all the other men knew that when they came around to, mingle with the women, they had to be very careful. Again, the first race in the World Championships, the top 4 women were disqualified, and then Melissa Gorman, the 5th woman, had to be reinstated. So everybody was on edge, and you had all these backstories. And so the men went out very slowly. The next 10K, they were also quite slow. You could see them. Peter Stoychev, another honoree, was swimming backstroke. They'd come to the feeding station, and instead of grabbing something, sucking it down and drinking, they were talking. Fortunately, and the weather at the 25K, it was quite warm. Sun was shining, and so it was
This was more like the Tour de France than a race to the death.
Absolutely. And what was made it very, very interesting in the men's 25K was that they did successfully go around the swimmers, but just once. The top women finished about 20 minutes after the men. So the men had just lapped them one time. It ended up that Martina Grimaldi was disqualified in the women's race. There was only, I believe, there was only one disqualification. But really, the whole Lake St. John 2010 World Championships came down to the last, I would say, 80 meters. And that was the most interesting, impactful race I've ever seen at this competitive level.
How many were in the mix at 80 meters?
80 meters, only 2. So in the last loop, Alex, Valerio, Cleri, and Peter Stoychev had pulled ahead. They were well ahead. They were 2.5 minutes ahead of the Italians, the French, Canadians, and other Americans. So there was a pack of 3, and the last loop, they knew 2.5K to go. This was it, and the pace significantly increased. And Alex has a very long stroke. He's got a very strong kick. And you could see that Alex had saved his legs for this last loop. Valerio Cleri, on the other hand, he was also at his peak. To put his perspective, to put his strategy and perspective, Valerio had finished fourth at the 2008 Olympics, fourth. There's almost no worse place to be at the Olympics than fourth. From that point, 2010, Valerio trained like few others in mankind's history. The man was a machine. And we knew that because when we'd go to these world championships, all the swimmers would be swimming together, and Valerio would get there before everybody. He would train faster than everybody, and he would stay later than everybody. The guy was just on a mission to get a medal. And Valerio, a few days before, had won the 10K race. So he was just like Eva. Valerio was at the top of his game. And obviously you had Stoychev, who at that time was on a nice streak of winning Lake St. John, Magog, Memphis Magog, Capri, Napoli. I mean, Peter, when it came to anything above 25K, he was outstanding. Again, to put it in perspective, he's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, at that distance. So you had Alex, Valerio, and Stoychev literally goggle to goggle looking at each other. They all knew that it would be a sprint at 2.5K to go, and they all had a lot of energy, in their tank. And Valerio took off. He was slightly ahead. Stoychev was being coy, and Alex had saved his legs. So they go around, so they got 2.5 to go. They've got 2K to go. They've got, 1.5K to go. They take the last, they pass the last feeding station. And, they've been in the water 5 hours now, over 5 hours. And they went whizzing past the feeding station. They've got 1K to go. And Alex just turns on his jets. You could just see his kick just come out of nowhere. At the time, I was on the shore near the finish. And Valerio is just a big upper body swimmer. And his stroke rate went probably, I don't remember exactly, but it probably went from a casual, 70, low 70 strokes a minute to over 80. The guy would just powering through the water. And Alex and Valerio pulled away from Stoychev, and it was a two-man race. So they come around the last buoy. The last buoy, it's probably 100 odd meters from the finish. Alex and Valerio are literally shoulder to shoulder, and they both see the finish. And Valerio just takes a 45-degree turn, a 45-degree angled turn into Alex. Again, keep in mind, Alex had just been disqualified the year before the World Championship for, swimming over a woman. So Alex knows that he's got at least a silver medal under his cap. Valerio is hungry, very hungry to win a second gold medal and to, come back from that very disappointing 2008 Olympic fourth place finish. And Valerio just takes a 45-degree turn into Alex, and he's pushing Alex away from the finish. At this point,
and is this technically allowed under the rules?
Absolutely not.
Okay, that's fine.
But again, that is under my interpretation. And to this day, this very key point, impeding, there are basically two rules in competitive elite open water swimming. And one is unsportsmanlike conduct, which is easy to understand. It's a punch, it's a kick, it's an elbow. That's quite clear on how to do it. Now, if you're wise, you can actually, do a little elbow, do a little pullback, do a little punch, as you know, as a water polo player, when the ref is not looking or underwater, going around a buoy, et cetera. But in general, the first major rule, unsportsmanlike conduct, is easy to call from a referee's perspective. The second rule in open water swimming to this day is impeding the progress of another swimmer. It has never been well defined. And it is always, and it is the intended impedance of another swimmer. Well, if I'm a referee, and I learned this when I was the FINA referee, how do I know the intention of another human being? So strictly applied, if I didn't intend, if Valerio did not intend to impede his progress, then it's okay. If he intentionally intended to impede the progress, then it's not okay. That's a very under the rules, it's a very difficult call.
And you can imagine that after the 10K drama, the referees and officials might have gotten together and said, you know something, we've had a lot of drama already, folks. Let's have less drama going forward. And we see this in sports all the time, where the referee, all of a sudden decides he or she's not calling anything anymore.
Yeah. Oh, we know it with, like the NBA professional basketball games. Okay. There's not going to be a foul, or, ice hockey or whatever. And that was it. That was, you perfectly summed up what was happening. The World Championship started out with a lot of DQs and a lot of controversy. They were definitely not going to end the competition with red cards and controversy. Now,
but in fairness to Alex, he might not have known that until 1 second after this 45-degree angle into him, which wasn't called.
Yes.
So all of a sudden, it's all of a sudden he goes, okay, so I guess there's no fouls now.
Yeah, that is exactly what happened. It's like when you would play water polo and some guy just clocks you and the ref doesn't call it. You think, okay, game on. This is the way the game is played, and this
Absolutely.
is the way the referees are going to call it. Same thing. So Valerio goes 45 degrees into Alex, is pushing him away from the finish. Alex, to his credit, actually does a crossover move. And he crosses over the legs of Valerio, which technically is a impedance, but they didn't call it. And Alex goes the other 45 degrees. Valerio, to his credit, there's almost nobody with Valerio's savviness when it comes to physicality in the water. He's Italian. He's had to fight his way through his Italian competitors just to get to the World Championships. So Valerio goes 45 degrees. Alex crosses his legs and goes the other 45 degrees. So what does Valerio do? Instead of just heading directly to the finish, Valerio goes after him like a shark and a baby seal. It was the most incredible thing. So Alex is swimming away from Valerio now, and Valerio turns back and, goes after him again, pushing him off. But at this point, Alex has a slight lead. They went back and forth, and Alex just, through smart tactics or a little bit of luck, probably a combination of both, as they were jockeying back and forth, Alex got the last little bit, and he beat him by, what was it? 12 hundredths of a second.
And presumably the crowd has a few comments as they're coming in.
Oh, the crowd is loving this. Oh, they're absolutely loving it. The Lake St. John crowd they're cheering for everybody anyway, all the time. But usually when you finish the traversée, it's one person finishes, 5 minutes later, another person finishes, 10 minutes later, another. Now the crowd, packed house, totally packed house, sees a whole week of very close finishes, very competitive sprints. And this was the culmination of that week. And it was just a great race. And, those issues are still unresolved, in my opinion, at the FINA level. What is impeding?
But Steve, if you think about basketball, there's going to be a foul or not a foul in every NBA final to the rest of time. In water polo, so any physical contact is always tough to referee.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how many times you put it on slow motion, it's still tough. And there's still an argument in a bar 3 years later about, did Charles Barkley actually, run into poor Danny Ainge, or was it a charge? I mean,
Right.
it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Do
But
you have
I just
do you
really
have
like
footage?
this.
Do you have footage of this you can show us now?
Pardon me?
Do you have the video you can show?
Yes.
Or are we not
I
clever enough to
can,
do that?
but it might take me. What I'll do is I'll put it in the article and show, and you'll see how exciting it is. But really, when you think about it, you had a perhaps the most famous venue in marathon swimming. You had an extremely packed house. You had the world's best, many Olympic champions, many Olympic medalists, many world champions, many top professionals there at various stages in their career. You had controversy, and the whole thing ends in this 80-minute zigzag sprint. It had everything, and it had all these backstories
So
that
the
made it
last 80 meters. What happened to these two guys afterwards? What happened to their careers?
Valerio now is a coach. He continued to win on the pro circuit. He continued to be a force. Unfortunately, he never won, his Olympic medal. He probably always regret that. But I mean, the guy raced everywhere against everyone, and he beat everyone at some point in the career. He beat Thomas Lures. He beat Peter Stoychev. He beat Yuri Kudinov. He beat the best of the best. And so his career lasted a long time. And he's a remarkable person. And he's also sharing his experiences with his swimmers now. He's a very serious guy, but he smiles. His swimmers like learning and training under him. Alex went on to the 2012 Olympics. He and the 2016. 2012 was probably his best shot. Unfortunately, excuse me. Unfortunately, before the Olympics in London, he was riding a bicycle to practice. He hit either a rock or brick or something, fell over his handlebars and broke his clavicle. So he was out for several weeks, and basically his Olympic chances of medaling were it was over. But to his credit, he got 10th. Even I don't remember exactly what month. It might have been February or so. February in Boston, it's cold. The streets are icy, and he's riding his bike to the pool at Harvard, and he just fell and had a terrible accident. But he came back and he got 10th in a very gutsy performance. He continued on. He went back to Lake St. John and won. That was sort of the pinnacle of his professional racing career, and that was a very satisfying race. And Alex continues to give back to the sport. He, in various ways, he coaches athletes, he mentors athletes, and this is not just professional marathon swimmers. This is like Valerio. He's out there with age group swimmers, young swimmers, someone who is older and wants to swim across the English Channel. Valerio and Alex are really giving back to the sport. Alex went on to do, he's an executive at different, I think it's fun, extreme sports. I forgot, it's the running equivalent of marathon swimming. So they've, everybody in that year, like my years, Philip Rush, Paul Asmuth, Shelley Taylor Smith, they continue to give back to the sport, continue to inspire and mentor people. And so does Alex and Valerio.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for
Yeah.
giving us that glimpse at the past. When we post the story, there'll obviously be a link to the video.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to seeing these 45 degrees and swimming over the back. Certainly in my little events, I do a lot of that. And occasionally I don't necessarily punch anybody going around, boy, but I certainly put the body on them in a sportsman-like way, I hope.
Yeah, and what is that? 202 centimeters of body on them. That's a lot of body.
Yeah, I think I've got the Claudio belly working now as well. So thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah, thank you.